Okay, hello everyone and welcome to our eLotus webinar today. My name is Donna and I will be your host and your moderator. For over 2 decades, eLotus has been your trusted source for TCM education. And we offer the largest selection of online CEU courses with over 3,000 CE hours. Now, if you are new to eLotus, remember to create an account today and receive a free 1 CEU course as a welcome gift. This offer is only available for new accounts only. Last year, we created a COVID resource page that featured herbal protocols from China, interviews with doctors, and other materials in English and 5 other languages. We have recently updated our eLotus COVID-19 resource page to include the 8th edition of Guidance for Coronavirus Disease 2019, an updated COVID-19 formula chart, detailed information on Qing by Dusan, and information and links about the UCLA, UCSD, and USC clinical studies. To find our eLotus COVID-19 resource page, go to elotus.org and look under free stuff. I will include the link in the chat room for you. Detailed descriptions of the herbs, including functions, indications, and research found in Qing Pai Dusan and other herbal formulas can be found in Dr. John Chen's herbology textbooks. There are 3 versions of these books available: the single herbs book, herbal formulas for humans, and herbal formulas for animals. These books can be purchased at www.evherbs.com. Today's webinar marks an important milestone for Chinese herbal medicine in the United States. I believe you understand what I'm talking about based on the title. Today's topic is FDA-approved modified Qing Pai Dusan for COVID-19, a multi-center, double-blinded, randomized control trial at UCLA and UCSD, presented by Drs. Lan Cao, Andrew Shubov, and Gordon Sachs. If you have any questions for any of the speakers during today's webinar, please write them into the chat room and let us know who you are asking. Please bear in mind that due to the time constraints, we will attempt to answer as many questions as possible during today's webinar. Let's get to know our speakers today. Dr. Lan Cao is a doctor of acupuncture and Chinese medicine with over 21 years of clinical experience, expertise, and leadership in the field of Eastern medicine. She is currently a research associate at the UCLA Center for East-West Medicine and a co-investigator on a multi-center FDA-approved double-blinded randomized control trial to evaluate the effect of Chinese herbal medicine to treat COVID-19. Dr. Andrew Shubov is the director of the Inpatient East-West Medicine Consult Service at UCLA Health Santa Monica and Medical Center. As part of the service, he and other East-West medicine physicians provide acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine, diagnostic and treatment strategies to critically ill hospitalized patients. He's board certified in internal medicine and integrative medicine. Dr. Shubov is lead investigator of the multi-center double-blinded randomized control trial to evaluate the effect of Chinese herbal medicine, as well as medical mushrooms to treat COVID-19. Dr. Gordon Sachs is the executive director of the Crump Center for Integrative Research, a preventative and integrative medicine physician and epidemiologist, a founding member of the UC San Diego Centers for Integrative Health, and a national leader in the food as medicine movement. He serves as the FDA-sponsored investigator of the mushroom and Chinese herbs for COVID-19 studies. And before we get started, Dr. John Chen, he is a recognized authority in both Western pharmacology and Chinese herbal medicine, and the lead author of the books, Chinese Medical Herbology and Pharmacology, Chinese Herbal Formulas and Applications, and Chinese Herbal Formulas for Veterinarians. He will go ahead and start us off with an introduction on the study, so let's go ahead and give him a big warm welcome.
Next slide. Okay, so like Donna said, this is not just a clinical event. This is actually quite a historical event. So before we have the main speakers from UCLA and UCSD, I just would like to step back so we can zoom out and take a bigger picture, look at a bigger picture so we can appreciate exactly what we are going through here. In the last year and a half, close to 2 years now, obviously has been a quite a difficult time for a lot of people. With the observation of COVID-19, what happened is a lot of protocol were quickly established in China, in the city level, in the provincial level, and also on a national level. So during my talk last year, I went through these in great details. But what I think is important is that not only do we have many protocols based on differential diagnosis, we also have protocols based on a generalized treatment. And the reason this is necessary is because in the very beginning, they were seeing hundreds and thousands of patients on a daily basis. So it's quite difficult to do a TCM differential diagnosis and prescribe formula accordingly. And as a result, in addition to differential diagnosis and treatment, they also came up with what they believe to be the best generalized treatment. So for all this information, if you're interested, you can go to the Guidance for Coronavirus Disease 2019 book published by in China. This book is available in both the Chinese version and also in the English version. So you can click on the link and it will bring you to the book itself. But like I mentioned, in this book itself, there's a lot of information on Western medicine. There's also a lot of information on traditional Chinese medicine. So the TCM treatment of COVID-19, as you can see here, is actually divided into many different types with corresponding treatment. So you have the observation phase, a clinical treatment period, and within the clinical treatment period, you have mild, moderate, severe, critical, and of course, at the end, recovery. And like I mentioned, one thing that's quite unique here is they also had a first line or umbrella treatment, and that's where the formula Qing Pai Du Tang comes in. All right. And for those of you who are not familiar with this formula, this is basically a formula following the principle of 4 additional formula. And they are Ma Xing Si Gan Tang, Se Gan Ma Huang Tang, Xiao Cai Hu Tang, and Wu Ling San. So these are the 4 formula that I listed. And the idea is to use the herb in these 4 formulas to basically clear the lung, eliminate the toxin, and then treat the infection. And if you were to break down the formula, it's actually quite a large formula with 21 ingredients. So this is the exact composition of the herbs and also the dosage. So this is what they were using as the generic first-line treatment for COVID-19 in China. And since that time, what happened is a lot of companies, a lot of products try to replicate the same thing. But what happened is most of them have to do some modification. And the reason is because there are 3 ingredients that are hard to source. One of them is ma huang because of its ephedrine alkaloid content. The other one is guandong hua, which is Floss fafara because it contains pyrrolidazine alkaloid. And the last one is Xi Sinasarum because it contains rosic acid. All right. So my point here is the original study that was done in China was done using bulk herb in decoction form. But if you were to do an internet search, you will find many different products that all have the same name, which is Qing Pai Du Tang. But if you look closely, you will see most likely the composition has changed, the dosage have changed, and most certainly the dosage form has changed. So it's no longer a decoction, but rather probably in capsule, tablet, tincture, or some other dosage form. So I can see if a patient hears the name Qing Pai Du Tang somewhere in a clinical study and they want this formula right away. But I think all of us as healthcare practitioners should really take the time to make specific differential diagnosis and prescribe individual formulas for the patient. I think that is the best way to get the optimal result. Nonetheless, in the last year or so, what happened is the folks at UCLA and UC San Diego have taken a lot of time, spent a lot of energy to come up with what we believe is the most effective version of this formula. And we have gotten the FDA, the DEA, and also the IRB to approve the modified Qing Pai Du Tang for COVID-19 in the clinical trial. All right. So in Chinese philosophy, there's a saying that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. In this particular case, the journey of botanical drug development we have just taken a giant leap forward. All right, so with that, let me turn the presentation over to doctors, Andrew Shubov, Goldman Sachs, and also Lon Kao.
Okay, I'm Gordon Sachs, and I'd like to frame the discussion before turning it over. Some kind of feedback there. I'd like to frame the discussion before turning it over to my colleagues, Dr. Shubov and Dr. Kao. So our story really begins on February 8th, 2020. Now, most of you date COVID to the latter part of 2019, but this is important because this was the date of our first University of California-wide Integrative Medicine Research Conference. This was sponsored by my institution, UC, University of California, San Diego, and held here in La Jolla. And it involved all 5 sister University of California medical centers. So UCSD, San Diego, UC Irvine, UCLA, UCSF, San Francisco, and UC Davis, all of them having integrative medicine research programs. And at the time of this conference, we were in the very early days of COVID here in the United States. I recall speaking with Dr. Kit Huey from the UCLA Center for East-West Medicine at the conference, and him describing COVID as something almost of a paper tiger, and telling us that Chinese herbal medicine had what appeared to be a remarkably effective treatment. Well, that really resonated with me. And the upshot of our conference was an agreement to continue having regular Zoom meetings to foster cross-campus research collaboration across the University of California. So, first slide, please. So suddenly, COVID was upon the land. And here in San Diego, our university basically had a decision that all non-essential research that could not be done remotely had to be put on hiatus for an indefinite period. This was part of the general California-wide shutdown because of COVID. So this meant that those of us who are involved with the Krupp Endowment, which is a very large research endowment that is supporting the present studies, and also many others focused on natural medicine, that the Krupp Endowment, that our normal grant funding cycle would have to be put on hold. In its place, our board decided to instead have a special allocation for integrative research specifically focused on COVID. About this time, I was introduced to Dr. Andrew Shubov, and he shared with me the core ideas for the Chinese herbal study, and he's going to have a lot more to say about this in a few minutes. But anyway, I was really excited by that conversation. And at the time, I had been thinking about a similar, slightly different, but similar natural medicine approach to COVID, the use of medicinal or polypore mushrooms that are known to have broadly based immune potentiating and antiviral effects. And Dr. Zev Rosenberg and I are very close friends, and we had discussed their use and their role in Chinese herbal medicine for years. So I suggested to Dr. Shubov that maybe we could combine forces and find a way to meld these natural medicines into a combination study. And that I thought that if we could do that, we could win support from the Krupp Endowment. And I shared with him that we also had a research core at UC San Diego that could step right up to the plate to help support the study and provide key resources. So he agreed, and we put our efforts forward. And next slide. The result was the birth of the MACH-19 study. MACH-19, mushrooms and Chinese herbs for COVID-19. So bear in mind, we're all natural, so warp speed is a little bit beyond our reach, but we were in a hurry to help address the medical problem of our lifetimes. So just to frame the discussion a little further, the MACH-19 study consists of 3 studies with a 4th in the works. Next slide. And all of these are double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized clinical trials. the first study, well, actually, let's go back one slide, Andrew. Yeah, thank you. Just to put this in context, research funding for these studies was provided by the Krupp-Endowed Fund, and also provided key services, including project management, phlebotomy, data management, all the kinds of things that are needed to be able to run a study. The UCLA investigational pharmacy played a key role, and they were the ones in charge of regulating and dispensing the study medications. And then in addition to those of us speaking today, we also have several other colleagues who are playing key roles in this study, and without whose help this could not have taken place. Next slide, please. So the MACH-19 studies, there's actually 3 of them with a 4th on the way. The first 2 are both FDA approved, and the first one is the study of the mushrooms that I mentioned, FOTV, which is Fomitopsis officinalis and Trametes versicolor, also known as agarikon and turkey tail, in the treatment of mildly to moderately ill self-quarantining COVID patients. The second one is the study that we're going to be mainly focusing on today, and that Dr. Shubov and Cal will be speaking about momentarily. And that's the study of a modified version of QFPD, Xingfei Paidutong, in treatment also of mildly to moderately ill self-quarantining COVID patients. These are labeled studies 1 and 2 only because this is the order in which they were approved by the FDA for study. But really, they're both very important, and our heart is in both of them. Next slide, please. Last fall, late summer, while we were waiting for FDA and others to move the studies forward through their process, we had a little time to kind of survey the landscape, and we realized, as discussion was coming out about the role of vaccines, and everybody was really kind of amazed how effective they appeared to be in their clinical trials, we realized that even with that, we're still going to have a problem on our hands. And so we decided maybe we should look at the mushrooms in particular as a potential way of enhancing vaccines, or for those who cannot use vaccines, an alternative for some individuals. But in any case, we're interested in looking at whether they can increase the overall response in terms of peak antibodies after vaccination. Can they reduce the rate of decline and prevent that waning of their effects? Can they enhance other aspects of the immune system beyond just antibodies? T-cell mediated immunity in particular, which could give us another way to have immunity against the virus. Can they attenuate vaccine side effects? And of course, we also need to just make sure that these mushrooms are safe in this context. Finally, we have a study which is pending, IRB review, which is going to look at the same basic study design in people who are getting booster shots. And we want to have a full range of studies looking at this. So anyway, now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Shubov, and he has much more to share with us about the Chinese herbal studies.
Dr. Schubert, your mic is mute.
Thank you. Are you getting feedback on this end? You're okay, right? Thank you, Dr. Chen. Thank you, Dr. Sachs, for the introductions and the background. It's really a privilege to be here. A year and a half ago, this whole thing was inspired by a webinar by Dr. Chen that he referenced already. And so you never know who the audience, what's going to happen out of these webinars, and you know, we all seek to stand on the shoulders of giants, as it were. I'd like to, we can't talk about the results yet of the clinical trial. That's going to come later. What we'd like to talk about today is the origin of the clinical trial, how it came to be. And in doing so, it might help to explain kind of the why we haven't seen a lot more similar, kind of the barriers to entry to this field, what needs to happen, and also potentially, hopefully, to explain how we came about designing the study in the way that it is now. We're going to describe how the study design was developed. I'm going to introduce Dr. Lan Cao. She's going to talk about the teams of experts that we convened to determine the interventions the way that we had it. She'll also discuss the safety measures that were being used and how we employ pattern diagnosis, even though it's in our randomized controlled trial. She'll then bring it back to me, and I'll share with you some of the hurdles that we had to deal with in terms of the administrative and FDA, DEA, IRB requirements in order to make a study like this happen. And hopefully, if there's time at the end, I'd like to offer some suggestions for streamlining this process and minimizing delays in the future. And then there'll be a Q&A where we're happy to continue to discuss further. So how to start, we have to bring us back to March of 2020. Again, Dr. Sachs talked about February of 2020. March was a much more stressful year for many of us. And I know it's kind of painful to think back then, but for me, this was the first time in my life that I saw the world mobilizing as though we were going to war. People really coming out of the woodwork to do different things. There's two different reactions to this. Many people would take their families and hunker down for safety. And on the other end, I had friends that were leaving really safe jobs in integrative medicine to go to the front line in New York City. Center for East-West Medicine, us here at UCLA, we were like many others, split both ways. Several of us that wanted to help had our own ways of wanting to help as well. And like many of you, we were privy to some of the information coming out of China that Dr. Chen had just alluded to, how they have had at this point several months of clinical experience treating this. They had 2,000 years of anecdotal evidence and practice on specifically respiratory viral epidemics. And we were watching these things being rolled out en masse in China, and yet it was increasingly frustrating to see how this was not only nowhere in the public mind in the US, but people were, out of a combination of fear and disinformation, were actually gravitating towards increasingly toxic treatments for COVID. It was frustrating at first and eventually infuriating. And what we saw, what we could offer would be several things. One is that we wanted to become a resource for people wanting to learn more about Chinese herbal medicine. Another is that we wanted to pivot from our current treatment practices to a COVID telemedicine clinic, which I'm sure many of you had the same ideas. Me personally, about 2 years prior, Dr. Annie Zhang and I started the inpatient East-West Medicine consult service at Santa Monica Hospital here at UCLA. And we were bringing acupuncture, Chinese medicine, and integrative medicine therapies to the frontline healthcare workers, which is a whole different topic of conversation. But I was watching friends of mine and colleagues hunkered down as though a battle was coming. We saw it happen in Italy. We saw it happen in New York, and then we're next. I had friends who were quarantining away from their family. We were expecting an onslaught. So we really wanted to protect them. We wanted to offer them herbs that we knew were helpful for prevention. So we brought this to our chair, and it was firmly shot down, firmly. The phrasing is actually very important. Knowing that this is one of the smartest people that we have at our institution, he said, "I certainly think that East-West has much to offer in terms of promoting wellness. However, giving the impression that herbs can mitigate COVID-19 does not seem evidence-based at this time, and I believe you should avoid such implications." And then he cited a misinformed article that, we thought we were heartbroken. Clearly, this was a big blow at the time. And now looking back, this was actually a very helpful way for him to say this. The concern was not so much, first of all, that Western medicine, generally these doctors don't know about herbs, and so there's a stigma against them. But moreover, there was fear, there was misinformation, there was concern that maybe if we start talking about certain herbs, like Dr. Chen was saying, we may use the term Qing Fei Pai Du Tang, and then a drug company may slap that label on something that is nothing near what we're intending to deliver. And so we may end up actually causing harm. And so it actually, it made it clear that we didn't need to be the authority on Chinese medicine. And as this time, Dr. Chen came out with his webinar, we started learning about all of the authorities on Chinese medicine becoming the authority on Chinese herbal medicine for COVID. This is not a place for us. And we also learned that we didn't need to be the herbalists providing Chinese herbal medicine either. All of you guys were doing that. You guys were doing a better job of it than we could. What we might be able to add to the conversation would be our role or our position at UCLA to leverage the research potential of a major academic hospital to add the high quality evidence that was reported here as missing. And in a sense, the goal of the Center for East-West Medicine is to translate Chinese medicine to the West. And the way that the language that's used by the US medical establishment is the language of double-blinded RCTs. And we looked, and this was nowhere on the horizon. So that would be our charge. Our first attempt was to offer Tang, which is for prophylactic medicine for our colleagues in the context of a clinical trial. We had to throw this one out eventually after doing some sample size calculations. Fortunately, what turned out was that in Italy, the healthcare workers there had very low infection rates, which was great. And it also meant that we would just need such a large sample size to demonstrate value that it was probably better that we target COVID patients directly. Not only we thought this might have a greater impact in terms of kind of politically, the idea of having Chinese medicine come on stage to fill a gaping hole in the Western pharmacopoeia, but also statistically, it actually had a much better rate, higher likelihood of succeeding because of 20%. Remember back then it was a 20% hospitalization rate for COVID-19 patients. If we can reduce that by half, then that's a doable study. We were advised to study outpatients only at the advice of our colleagues in integrated infectious disease. The hospital is a very crowded place for COVID research at the time, and also herbs are not going to go well when having to go through a hospital pharmacy. So a month after the meeting that Dr. Sachs referred to, we have these monthly smaller meetings that were started about a year or two prior, where all 5 universities, California Centers for Integrated Medicine, meet to chat and say what we're up to. Lorraine McElhern put this together, and this fell exactly into the kind of collaboration that I think they were trying to achieve here. We were able to connect with Dr. Gordon Sachs, who was, as he said, was looking into medical mushrooms to treat COVID-19 with almost identical overlap of our intentions here. And with the generous support of the Crump and Down Fund, the study was launched. We also had buy-in from UCSF and UC Irvine also came in to bring what we had now at the end of March 2020. At the end of, I'll say, 2 weeks of the two of the most interesting weeks I've had in my life, I think. But we had a multi-center double-blinded RCT, COVID-19 positive outpatients confined to home quarantine. We would have 2 stages. Stage 1 would be safety feasibility of 33 patients per arm, during which, and I'll say this in a second, we are going to be looking at, or we are presently looking at, some efficacy markers. However, the actual efficacy stage would be later, depending on, with the initial idea of 240 patients per arm. But of course, that would be tailored based on our results from stage 1. There are several outcomes for stage 1 that I'm not going to get into. We'll discuss this when it's time to actually present the findings. But in addition to safety, we are looking at a lot of efficacy markers. So which herbs to use now? So what are we going to do? We're going to study COVID-19 outpatients. And Dr. Chen laid out the national treatment guidelines for COVID-19. They're coming out of China. As he said, there's multiple formulas. The mainstay of treatment here is pattern-based diagnosis based on stage of disease or pattern. Option 2 is a large rollout that was happening in China of Qing Pai Du Tang. Now, my ears perked up at this second rule because trying to run a clinical trial with multiple interventions, having each of those interventions pass the FDA is extremely challenging. From a clinical trial perspective, if you want to have a double-blinded randomized controlled trial, you need a single intervention, at least in the model of how it's done currently. This, of course, is one of the barriers to Chinese herbal medicine research in the US. On the other hand, this would be our one chance to demonstrate the value of Chinese medicine, maybe hopefully not the one chance, but this was a major push to demonstrate the value of Chinese herbal medicine for something that the world genuinely needs. And can we really use Qing Fei Pai Du Tang, which is something that is not the way that we may practice medicine? What would you do? I mean, this is a very, very difficult conversation. We recognized early on that we were not the experts that should be the ones making this decision. I'd like to pass this along to Dr. Lan Cao, who's going to describe what we did. She'd have to grab the screen share from me in order to get it.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, great. Let me just. Okay, great. I'd like to thank Dr. John Chen and his team for having us here today, come and speak on the clinical trials. So as Dr. Shubov mentioned, we had a study design before we had a formula. And so this part of the talk, I will focus on the Chinese herbal medicine arm of the MOC-19 study, study 2. And as the co-investigator on the team, I'm also the Chinese medicine herbal medical monitor, which is a rather unique role. It's not every day we come across a clinical trial that has an herbal medicine monitor. So, like Dr. Shubov mentioned, we didn't jump into Qing Fei Pai Du Tang. It took a lot of reflection, and we called upon clinicians and researchers from the UCs, but also Chinese medicine professionals from the community. When Andrew and I had a discussion on a Saturday morning about early in March about what was going on in the world, and I was sharing with him what was going on in China with the Chinese herbs, and he mentioned about Dr. John Chen's webinar. So we really had this call to action, and so how can we help? And so we consulted UCLA Dr. Kakit Huey and Dr. Shuling Ma and Dr. Wei Jun Zhang to help us come up with a formula that has data backing it up and that has been shown to be effective and safe. And in that process, we also, like I mentioned, called upon experts in the community. Not all of them are here on this list, but for instance, we reached out to Dr. John Chen to help us with the safety issues with the formula that we end up using, the Qing Fei Pai Du Tang, and Dr. Zev Rosenberg as well, who really inspired us to incorporate some differential diagnosis, and Dr. Willow Liu, she helped us to analyze the chemistry of each herb in the formula, and Dr. Hua Bingwen is my teacher, peer, and friend who really helped me gather data and information on this formula, because early on, at least in the US, there weren't many that were using this formula, or neither was it accessible unless you literally made the formula yourself. So it was very, very little literature on this formula, especially in terms of safety at that time. We only found a handful, and Dr. Zhang was really instrumental in helping us initially with those early studies. And so here. Okay. And so this guidance for the coronavirus, like John had already mentioned earlier, now they have 8th version, which is fantastic. But East West Center, we were really fortunate to have access to it early on in March. And we saw what was the treatment guidelines that were being used in China to treat COVID, but not just that, but for prevention and control as well, management and also recovery stage. And so we use this as part of the study design. But as I mentioned, and Dr. Sachs and Dr. Schubach mentioned earlier, we had a study design before we actually had a formula. So here in the text, you'll find, and this is an older version, it's actually version 7, I believe. The COVID is divided into 4 categories, and the general, the mild, the general, severe, and critical cases. And on the right column box, you'll see that there was an attempt on the authors to do some differentiation, but it's not a very clean one because, I shouldn't say that. It's pretty extraordinary what they did at the time. What I mean is that it's not just strictly Shanhan Lun here that they did the differentiation. For instance, if you look under the general type cases, on the right box, like damp poison obstructing the lungs, for instance, or under severe cases, it has lung blocked by epidemic toxins. And so these terms are, relating to pestilence. And so there's a text that that I've only recently gotten familiar with as well, the Wen-Yi Lun. So it's very different from the Shanhan Lun in that it deals with transmissions of plagues. And the difference between the two, the Shanhan Lun and the Wen-Yi Lun, which came out around the 1600s, is that, again, it deals with transmission of plagues, but also the dealing with the transmission of virus and the incubation period of a virus. And where the Wen-Yi Lun talks about when we're dealing with study of warm epidemics, is different from studying cold diseases, because in warm epidemics, one of the key transmission for the pathogen is to the nose and the mouth, where Shanhan Lun is more through the skin. And it's mentioned in this classic as well of the Wen-Yi Lun is that old, young, strong, weak, anyone, it can be susceptible to getting the pathogen. And so in these diagnosed patterns that you see is not just Shanhan Lun. And the symptoms that I put next to the diagnosis, this would be relevant later on in the talk regarding how we were able to incorporate some of this into some form of pattern differentiation in the midst of using a drug model to study an herbal formula. So, excuse me, I'm going to go back to slide 1. So if you look on the box under the clinical treatment period for confirmed cases, the first line formula, as Dr. John Chen pointed out earlier, is Qing Fei by Du Tang. Oh, sorry for the typo. So this particular formula is effective for mild, general, and severe cases, but also it can, when used by itself. But for critical cases, it can also be used in combination with biomedicine. It's a formula that is very versatile and and you'll see that it is a multi-targeted formula. It's a complex formula, but a complex formula needed for a complex, complicated condition, such as COVID. It's a formula that is not to be used for prevention. And once the condition subsides and is resolved, then is no longer appropriate to use. It is appropriate to use for long COVID as well. So this is the author, one of the authors of the formula, Dr. John Bowley. He and his team on the left developed this formula. He's 72 years old, one of the physicians in Wuhan, and really a key contributor to the recovery in China. So by February of 2020 last year, the China Health Commission and the Administration of Traditional Chinese Medicine jointly issued a notice recommending QFPD for the treatment of COVID-19, given its effectiveness as well as safety. And this, so around the same time, the vice president of the Beijing University of Chinese Medicine also noted the wide distribution of this formula throughout the province. So, you all probably already are familiar with these formulas. So again, Qing Fei Baidu Tang, the composition is combination of these four formulas, these that are mentioned in the classic treatise of Shanhan Lun, coal-induced diseases. So Ma Xing Shi Gan Tang, I'm going to stick with opinion, so my apologies to those that are not as comfortable with opinion, but I do have the Latin title underneath there. So Ma Xing Shi Gan Tang, Xiao Chai Hu Tang, Shi Gan Ma Huang Tang, Wu Ling San, and then additional 4 herbs, Shan Yao, Jie Shi, Chen Pi, and Huo Xiang. And the comment, this is a 20 herb formula, and the individual herbs in red that I've highlighted are the herbs that are in the formula. What was taken out is in blue. So in Xiao Chai Hu Tang, Renshen was taken out, as well as Da Cao. And in Shi Gan Ma Huang Tang, Wu Wei Se was taken out. And so there are reasons for that. I have my theories for that, probably not to contribute to any further inflammation. So we know that Ma Xing Shi Gan Tang, for instance, treats common cold, fever, influenza, viral infections, and it can impair the viral surface structure as well in preventing the virus from entering the body. And Shi Gan Ma Huang Tang is often used for flu-like symptoms, asthma, inflammation, tonsillitis, and sore throat. And Xiao Chai Hu Tang is a wonderful kind of lymphatic drainage, having antiviral properties as well as anti-carcinogenic properties. And Wu Ling San is addressing the urinary system and the kidney system as well, and improving kidney excretion function, which is so important, the urinary function, and also the GI system excreting the pathogen when there is a toxin present in the system. So that is one of the experts in, I think it was Dr. Hai-He Tian in Florida, but also Dr. Jianbing Fang in Wuhan, who talked about how if the pathogen is still in the system, is really important for the person to expel, for the body to expel it. So, let the diarrhea happen, let the urination happen as well until the virus can exit the body. So you can see that these 4 formulas address different areas of the body, targeting different areas of the body, in addition to the lymphatic system. The additional herbs, those 4 additional herbs help to support and protect the GI functioning. So having anti-diarrheal, antiemetic, and helping to regulate all 3 jiaos, all the upper jiao, the middle jiao, and the lower jiao. And that, again, supporting Xiao Chai Hu Tang's functioning of helping to cleanse and drain the lymphatic system. So again, QFPD is a multi-targeted formula. There are 2 published studies that I reviewed generally. It was very technical, molecular biology language, but it's, so these formulas, again, they work very synergistically together. The top formula, for instance, the MXSG, Ma Xing Shi Gan Tang, we know that it goes to the lungs. It deals with respiratory infections. And then also Shi Gan Ma Huang Tang also goes to the lungs, dealing with asthma, inflammation, tonsillitis, and sore throat. Xiao Chai Hu Tang goes to the liver, which has, again, antiviral effect, promoting lymphatic drainage. And we know that, there's the ACE2 receptors are found not only in the lungs, but also in the intestines. That's why intestinal GI issues and dysfunction is so often found in those that are infected with COVID. And Wuling San, again, going to the kidneys and the bladder system, helping support the urinary system and promoting excretion. And the AH for additional herbs. All of the 4 herbs I mentioned, the Shanyao, the Zhishi, the Chenpi, and Huoshang, all go to the lungs, spleen, and stomach, except that Zhishi also goes to, Zhishi goes also to the intestines, but also, and the Shanyao goes to the kidneys. And it's really interesting because now with the Delta variant, these particular herbs are so important in terms of the GI symptoms, more so that we're seeing recently. So I thought that was pretty brilliant of the original authors of this formula. And, how is multi-targeted. So this one study that's studying the mechanism of how Qing Fei Baidu Tang works in the body is that the benefits of the formula is not just antiviral, anti-inflammatory, and that this is via the regulation of metabolic processes, but also these disrupting these networks where the virus uses to replicate. So is very extraordinary formula. Okay, so we didn't use the original formula because of these following reasons. Primarily for safety issues, and secondly, the study, in case we didn't have favorable outcomes, then the modified Qing Fei Baidu Tang that we developed would not negatively impact the original QFPD decoction. And then lastly, the study team didn't have any intention of commercializing the product. So how were the safety issues addressed? Again, we reached out to Dr. John Chen, who was an instrumental part of our study design dealing with safety. So he helped us identify each herb within in the entire formula, the herb-herb interactions, as well as the herb-drug interactions. And as he pointed out earlier, the 3 herbs that stood out, of course, are Guangdonghua, because the pyrrolizidine acid, and then with Ma Huang and Xixing. And so Ma Huang in particular, because it has, it's an ephedrine alkaloid, so it's very stimulating and affecting the central nervous system as well as the cardiovascular nervous system. And with Xixing, Xixing tends to have traces of aristolochic acid, and that herb is also contraindicated for those that are pregnant, as well as for children, elderly, people with pre-existing conditions, deficiencies. So we modified Guangdonghua, but we kept Ma Huang and Xixing because we needed to keep the formula as intact as possible while developing the formula to account for safety. And lastly, the team created a Chinese herbal medicine medical monitor, yours truly, to oversee any adverse effects with steady medication of the MQFPD, modified. And so my role is to advise the medical monitors, which is Dr. Andrew Shubov and Dr. Dan Slater, should any issues come up for participants in the study too that are using that study medication. So I'm going to skip through this. So the safety issues, we incorporate this into, of course, the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So inclusion is anyone of age 18 or older is welcome to participate as long as they have proof of positive COVID-19 diagnosis. They're willing to limit alcohol, cannabis, and dairy products. Now, this was a requirement initially, but we were concerned that many would we turned away from that. So we switched it to recommended. And the participant would be able to communicate with us through email, phone, well, not with us, with study staff, and then able to write down their symptoms on a daily basis within the daily diary. So this exclusion criteria for the entire MOC-19 study, this is what we have. Anything in red, any yes answers to the red, these participants are recommended to see their physicians and immediately. But if it's questionable, then they can consult with the medical monitor. On the right column, the exclusion, the black is, again, any participants that are under any other study using investigational agents to treat COVID were not qualified for the study. And anyone with liver disease, renal disease were also excluded from the study, as well as uncontrolled hypertension. Those are pregnant or even breastfeeding. Now this is rather, we extended the exclusion criteria, especially for the herbal arm of the study, for obvious reasons, especially having a 20 herb formula as big as Qing Bai Tang. So on this list, you'd be surprised, for instance, that some of these medications can have adverse effect or interactions with the herbs, like for instance, the use of tolbutamide and interferon, that can interfere with Xiao Chai Hu Tang. And on the right side, anyone using like MAOIs or recent use of methamphetamine and cocaine, they were all excluded from the study. So here is my attempt to incorporate and maintain some differential diagnosis in the study. So among the 4 classifications of COVID, like I mentioned earlier, it's not a clean differentiation because of the presence of the toxins, the pestilence in the nature of the disease. So I did the best I could. I struggled initially doing this because there wasn't a lot of information. And I had to rely on their literature that we had, as well as colleagues and peers and teachers, and just ask and so these are, not all these symptoms are included in my next slide in what we call a daily diary. And so I didn't include all these symptoms, but I included many, if not most of them. The boxes in red is where I had to bring in the Wen-Bing theory as well to understand where the different stages of the disease a patient could have. And it was clearly like in the Shaoyin and Jueyin stages. So these are the symptoms, just keep them in mind. For instance, what I learned from Dr. Hua Bing Wen, if anyone, has muscle aches. So muscle aches is a clear indication that, the Taiyang stage, people are still at the Taiyang stage, and the disease is lingering, and is actually very not common, but it happens where an individual can have all 3, like they could have Taiyang, Bing, Yangming, and Shaoyang all together. And there's a formula that's very good for that, is Chai Ge Jie Ji Tang. But anyway, that's just to give you an idea of the complexity of the patterns that clinically folks are seeing with COVID patients. It's not one clear, oftentimes it's not just one clear pattern. So here is the daily diary that participants use and to log their daily symptoms. And so on this list, we have symptoms for COVID in addition to symptoms that are considered as potential side effects or adverse effects from the herbs in Qing Bai Tang, as well as symptoms for differentiation that you just saw the list. So And then on top, I also, we need to create a scale for the symptom scoring of each symptom with 0 through 4. That's the top right corner. And so this gives the participants and the study coordinator an idea of how severe their symptoms are each time they logged in. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm going to turn the floor back to Dr. Shubov. And I just want to make a quick mention, because there was a comment in the chat box, that we're in the middle of recruitment. We're not complete with the study yet. So please keep that in mind as you listen to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cao. So yeah, there's been some questions in the comments. This is an FDA-approved clinical trial. This does not mean that QFPD is FDA-approved for to receive botanical drug clearance for approval. I'm going to actually go through that right now. This is, as you know, the drug pipeline with the FDA and with clinical trials, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4, takes up to 10 years. So we are going down the first few steps down this process. And to us, this was a huge deal that the FDA would even approve this as is. And we'll talk about what it took to get here, and actually to clarify some misconceptions about the FDA and their motivations. But that should be stated that this does not mean you can all run out and necessarily, well, actually, no, it's not true. Acupuncturists can do what they find appropriate throughout their license. What we're trying to do is grant larger legitimacy beyond the acupuncture Chinese medicine community, specifically trying to bring this to the Western medicine community that is otherwise currently frustratingly unaware of the value here of Chinese herbal medicine. So like Dr. Cao was saying, we became, as we dug deeper into Qing Pai Tang, we became more comfortable with the idea of using it as a sole agent. This didn't come at a, we gathered as many experts as we could: Dr. Zeb Rosenberg, Dr. John Chen, Dr. Willa Liu, Kakit Huey, Tommy Cheng, several others that we could find, all to discuss, to hash this out together. And the end of the day, as Dr. Cao had mentioned, we ended up being okay with Qing Pai Tang so long as it is minimally substituted. And as Dr. Chen showed, most versions of this are quite often substituted. And if we have one shot, we need the closest adhering version of this formula that we could come up with. We're going to study the kind of as it were the authentic version of it. And so we did substitute Guangdong Hua. We did not substitute Xishen or Ma Huang. What that involves is a huge amount of challenges. Let's start with the supply and manufacture component of this. Not to mention, we need to find a manufacturer that has these two herbs that are banned, Xishen, because it contains ursolithic acid in some preparations, and Ma Huang. But beyond that, we have to administer this in a double-blinded fashion. We can't blind an herbal decoction. We needed to use granules and fit those into capsules. And as Dr. Chen had mentioned, this is a 200 gram formula with 21 herbal components. Capsules can only fit half of a gram each. No one's going to take 400 grams per day. We felt that the maximum that we can ask a study participant to take would be about 8 capsules 3 times a day. That would give us 12 grams. The maximum extraction we can condense into granules would be a 7-to-1, which means that the 200 gram formula gets condensed into 28.5 grams. And then we were stuck because we needed an extra 50% excipient used in the encapsulation. Again, what do you do? What we did, we dug further. We partnered with Sun 10 Pharmaceuticals, Sun 10 Laboratories, in their Taiwan hub. They were able to use specialized techniques to minimize the excipient used to 5 to 10%. So our 200 gram formula came down to about 30 grams. And of that, we can only deliver 12 grams. We brought this now back to the same panel of herbalists to see if this was enough. And this is how the sausage is made. And unfortunately, this was not the ideal target dose, but what the universal reaction was basically grumbling and then said, yes, okay, generally this was probably the minimum successful dose. Now, it turns out that we now see other studies going on at USC that are using the same protocol, which is what they're extending the dose out to 14 days. And so between the two of us, we'll see what ends up happening. But fortunately, when we ended up running the data or the numbers on the amount of ephedrine in each capsule, this was easier to sell to the FDA because now we were able to condense it to actual daily limits of ephedrine. To continue working with Sun 10, we had to get their agreement to not only create a dedicated extract of all these botanical raw materials for a dedicated batch for this one study with a low excipient ratio. We also had to make them promise that they had Qixin with undetectable amounts of ursolithic acid based on FDA-approved mass spectroscopy studies. We also had to be confident that each of their herbs was capable of passing strict requirements, as I'm going to discuss. And of course, they had to be patient with us as we were quite demanding of their time. This is one of the major hurdles of why you don't see more of these kinds of research before we even go to regulatory requirements. And I should also say that we have no commercialization intent. And so the company couldn't really partner with us to make a 10-year-long contract to bring an herbal botanical drug to market, because we're all expecting that by the time that would actually happen, there would be no COVID, knock on wood. So with that, we were able to move on to the regulatory requirements. Regulatory requirements are the three-letter acronyms, the TLAs, notably the FDA, the IRB, and the DEA. The DEA is not usually involved, but because we were using Ma Huang, which many of you are familiar with the sordid history in the US, contains ephedrine, we had to get them involved. I'll start with the FDA, and I'm going to go through the other ones relatively quickly because I know we're kind of running over time. There's a lot of misconceptions with the FDA, and especially their relationship to herbal medicine. We have had to interact with a lot of bureaucratic institutions here along the path, and I'm not paid to say this, but genuinely, the FDA has been the most timely, friendly, well, not friendly, but professional and frankly flexible organizations that we had to deal with. When it came down to it, when we weren't able to meet 100% of their strict requirements, they let us go with the extra 2% because they wanted to see this happen. I didn't see any evidence of negative bias. I didn't see any attempt for them to just block this. There was no unreasonable anything coming from them. What was coming from them was elevating this to the strictest standards of drug development. And elevating any drug to the strictest standard of drug development is very challenging, and elevating 21 herb formula is exponentially worse. The process involved with talking with the FDA, it first starts with talking to them. And I highly encourage any of you to just open the conversation if you're thinking about this, because they're quite open about this. They don't want you to apply if you're not really, if this is not a good idea. We had the fortunate help of someone named Marlene Barrow, who at UCLA works as the FDA liaison. And without her, I think most clinical trials involving the FDA would probably not happen at UCLA. And so some of you work at institutions where there are a lot of people you can tap into. You submit a pre-IND application that is given 60 days for review. So 60 days for what's almost a 100-page document was edited line by line and poked through to then come up with a pre-IND meeting. This pre-IND meeting, usually I think we get flown out to, on our dime, flown out to Washington, DC or wherever it was. Instead, it took the place of a very stressful phone call where they told us that half the mushroom arm, where they told us to go ahead and submit the IND. This was a favorable pre-IND meeting for us. It still took us another 2 months to respond to their concerns. And we submitted the formal IND application in early July of 2020. So this is about 3 months after we first designed our study protocol. So that was fast. That was not warp speed. Anyway, if approved, they have 30 days to then respond with what's called a study may proceed letter. meaning the study may proceed. In our case, we had a partial study may proceed letter for the mushroom arm, and then they issued a clinical hold for the Chinese herbs. And this was because, I'm going to tell you why in a second, but essentially because we have not completed manufacture of the herbs that we're going to use yet. So there's no testing to demonstrate value. Demonstrate safety, or that the herbal product that we're using is what we say it is. So once we finally had all the information to give them, the request of the clinical hold was lifted within 30 days. So there was no delay on their end, there's a delay on our end. But this actually helps to understand some of the timelines behind. If you remember, the timelines behind some of the vaccine studies were coming out around the early safety studies were coming out around July, August, remdesivir, all of these things, the timeline kind of fits. So in 2016, any of you that might be interested in botanical drug development should be aware that this document came out in 2016, which is a big update to a former document in 2004, which I was told has basically been the FDA's attempt to bend with the requirements of botanical drug development. It reads, well, it makes for good nighttime reading, but it lays out very, very clear paths to follow. To step back a moment, when is an herb a drug? An herb is a drug depending not on what it's made out of, but what it's intended for. And an herb, any herb that's used to treat, to diagnose, treat, cure, mitigate disease is a drug. A dietary supplement can have certain rules around it where it supports disease or something like that. But we were looking at a randomized control trial where our intention is to look at its effect on COVID-19, meaning there's no way around the definition that we are using it to treat COVID-19. Other opportunities for study here would be to use an observational study design. When you do what you normally do, you give your best medical care as you possibly can as a practitioner and study those that do. That may involve pattern diagnosis with individualized herbal prescriptions, and then study it later, because these are not drugs regulated by the FDA. These are herbs regulated by your license as a herbalist or licensed acupuncturist or whatever that may be. So the FDA requirements come into 5 large categories. Don't worry, we're not going to get too far into it. We're just going to focus in on the third one here. The first 2, chemical constituents and prior human experience. I don't want to, this is a lot of work on us, but it wasn't actually a big delay. This is basically the background and other data that's available for each of the individual components of the 21 herbs, prior human experience for many of the component herbs that are used, or sorry, herbal formulas that were described. The big thing was the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. We needed tests for each of the 21 herbs for elemental impurities, heavy metals, microbial limits, residual pesticides, including parent pesticides, and metabolites, aflatoxins, foreign metals, and adulterants for each of the 21 herbs. Also, and this I want to point out, the FDA has to determine whether a plant species is determined to be endangered, threatened, or entitled to protection, or in a critical habitat that has been determined to be endangered or threatened. This happened to not apply to us, but I just point this out again to compliment the FDA for what they're trying to do, which is keep people safe. And their charge expands beyond that, but to keep the world safe as best as they can within their little scope of the U.S. Federal Drug Administration. But fascinating, and also helpful to know, given some of the history of the Chinese materia medica. Within each botanical substance, we needed a qualitative description of drug substance. So this is taken not from China. This is not from Western medicine. This is standard with Chinese herbal medicine. A quantitative description of the drug substance and description of the manufacturing process. This last little bit, by the way, incidentally, to get a non-disclosure agreement signed between 2 academic institutions and an overseas manufacturer took a few months I didn't expect. Quality control tests should include, but not limited to, strength by weight, chemical identification of the active constituents if known, meaning that there's flexibility if we don't know. Quantification of the active constituents if known. So we use gypsum as one of the, Shigao as one of the components. We didn't have to make something up about what the chemical constituent was going to be. We need a test for residual pesticides, elemental impurities, as we talked about. Now, we had to go through this whole process, begin manufacture of the substance, and then hope, with our fingers crossed, that all of the botanical drug raw botanical herbs met these requirements. We also needed quantification of ephedrine and pseudoephedrine for Ma Huang and arysilolic acid by 2 different tests. So mass spectroscopy and by FDA-approved methods. So our fingers were crossed, their fingers were crossed. Sometime on, hats off to them. They make good product and it passed all the tests. But there was a moment there where we were terrified. If progressing to phase 3, and this is why the FDA approval process for formal approval may be quite challenging. So you need biological assays proving batch-to-batch consistency over time, over years. If you had to make a wine the same way every year after year, it's quite challenging, and it's as much an agricultural effort as it is a processing effort. Mass balance and stability data, these things we don't need to talk about. What we used a single batch. It's a large batch, but that is the single batch that has been FDA approved for this study. That allowed us to actually feasibly make this happen. The final botanical product also had to be characterized, similar things. We'll skip over this. Now, once we had the FDA approval, we could send that to the IRB. IRBs are institutional review boards charged with the safety of preserving the safety of study participants. All clinical trials have to be regulated by the IRB. In a multi-center study, one IRB is generally used and the others rely on that one. Had we done it differently, we might have been more strategic in choosing which one, and I'll leave it at that. But generally, there was about a 30 to 60 day delay past any submission when we could not move forward until the IRB reviewed it. Lastly, the DEA. This clinical trial did require communication with the DEA. Not only did we have to let them know that we were using what's called a list 1 chemical, which, by the way, very few people at the DEA have ever heard. I mean, they're not colloquially familiar with this. The list 1 is not a scheduled substance. It is a precursor for illicit drug manufacture. So it needs to be registered for importation. It's generally banned for importation. We had to import it. 9 months after red herring to try to become an importer, we found out that the easy thing to do, by the way, if this ever comes up, is there are importers that have licenses to import Ma Huang. That's all you need to know. Now, we thought we were ready. We got the IRB and the FDA started, and then the political challenges hit. Now, the political challenges, I don't mean nationally political. We were very fortunate to avoid anything related to the national political climate during 2020. But the individuals that we worked with changed they sobered up. There was a lot of excitement in those first few months. By the summer, a lot of that dried up. They moved up to different things. They had their jobs back. UCSF had to take leave, UCI eventually as well. We were working with La Jolla Immunology for some complete genome expression profiling, immune data, which was phenomenally interesting. And Cedars-Sinai Medical Center also. But the bigger thing was these COVID task forces. So again, bring yourself back to March of 2020. Everybody wanted to try to help here, every single person. I actually, I got a phone call from a urologist who was using a herbal product to make erections last longer. And he said, called me and said, "You're doing herbal medicine research. Maybe this is a pulmonary vasodilator. Can we study this?" I say this just to say that anybody that had something in their hand wanted to use that thing to study COVID. We were in touch with biometric people that wanted to study COVID. What this ended up doing was clogging the academic institutions of the ability to actually do the things that were mandated by, not mandated, but were prioritized by the National Institutes of Health or funded. Things that ironically didn't pan out, such as hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. Those were elevated on the pedestal, and studies like ours were not allowed to do, or we're not allowed to move forward. Now, we were able to communicate directly with the members of the COVID task force at UCLA to let them know who we were, what we were trying to do, where we're, and what Chinese medicine is. And frankly, some institutional history of the Center for East-West Medicine was helpful. People knew about East-West medicine. They knew about Chinese herbal medicine. This was not a, there's substantially less stigma there. Even then, they almost denied the study. but they allowed us to use it as long as we didn't use any of the recruitment strategies that have been built for the COVID navigation, for the COVID research projects there. I should also say that this was expected to have, we expected another New York City in Los Angeles. It turns out we got one in the winter, but in the spring, there was almost no cases for these studies were all ramped up and ready to go, and the patients were extremely hard to come by for these studies. So it was, we essentially failed to convince these COVID task forces that we were important, which is the entire purpose of this clinical trial, is to change that for future studies. Not for us, for you guys. The COVID task force at UCSD was less favorable. They disapproved the study altogether, and it took us a couple of months before we circled our legal horses and discovered that as long as we work outside of their purview and don't use any UCSD resources, we can do this. Nevertheless, they were the groups that got in our way. In addition to that, we did need to establish relationships with all these people, just to say it was a big headache. Now, once we got there, we had to import and dispense this. We don't need to get into this. I know we're running past time, but generally this is our timeline. Just to give you a sense of where why it took us this long to get there. And why you're actually starting to see things come out now that were happening there. So these are in your handouts. The final challenge is that we finally got all of the regulatory requirements satisfied, and the IRB approved, the FDA lifted the clinical hold. We got the medication in this UCLA pharmacy. We got the IRB to approve us, and COVID rates fell to an all-time low. Unfortunately, it's with had heavy heart to say it, and I don't mean that there's a silver lining here, but for us, we do have an opportunity here to use it to recruit that we didn't expect to have. And so we'd like to ask for your help. If you know of any patients, or if you come across patients who have active COVID within the first 7 to 9 days of symptom onset, and they're local to us, Los Angeles or San Diego, they'll have a mobile phlebotomist come to their house and do everything. They get $250 for participation, and here's the study line. It's also in the study information. We'll open this up for Q&A in a second. We also have to say that the pandemic has evolved, that we now have to exclude participants receiving monoclonal antibody, not monoclonal antibody testing, monoclonal antibody therapy for COVID-19. Also, we are going to have to change our efficacy markers because fortunately hospitalizations have dropped precipitously with vaccination rates. But the nice thing is that of the COVID task forces, all the other trials that were clogging up their system have now been completed or halted. So we are now the priority for UCLA, and one of the priorities for UCLA, and also UCSD has also lifted all of their requirements, their restrictions. So we're set to go. We're very excited. Thanks again for this platform, and I'd like to open this up to Q&A. Maybe I'll stay on until somebody else.
We will ask questions now. I'm just waiting for everyone else to pop up.
I have a question for Dr. Shubov. Where did you get the stamina and the persistence from?
I'm not sure, but I'm not going to do it again in the same way. I'll tell you that.
Okay, I'll ask a question. If this clinical trial is successful and Qing by Dusan is approved to treat COVID, does that make it recognized as a drug? And if so, would it then be out of the scope of practice for acupuncturists to use it if it is classified as a drug? Dr. Shubov, this question would be for you.
I was trying to avoid it. It's a good question. So first of all, we are not going to move. We're not capable of moving all the way to drug development. I think the idea of having this regulated as a botanical drug would involve a kind of a proprietary, not formula, but a proprietary sourcing of herbs that can be replicated. And I don't see that as, actually, I'd ask Dr. Chen's advice on here. I don't see how labeling something as a drug that's not available for large scale consumption could reduce the ability of an herbalist to prescribe and what's otherwise an open source formula. I don't consider myself an expert on this one, but
Okay, thank you. For Dr. Cow, the last slide with the symptom scale form was not in your notes. Can that be made available?
We haven't published the study yet, and it hasn't yet, it's not yet completed. But as soon as we complete this trial, we'll be able to publish it and share it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cow. What does the FDA approval mean for the community?
the FDA approval is, first of all, again, it's limited to the study. So the study is FDA approved. The study has allowed us, perhaps a good recently psychedelics are becoming FDA approved for clinical trial research. They're not legal it does not change the legality of its use. And similarly, the FDA, this means that there is, it elevates the stature. It's more that we now have a clinical trial that is stamped by the FDA as a valid study to move forward. And hopefully we'll be able to demonstrate first safety and ideally efficacy as well. That I think will, that's the real story here. It's not necessarily that the FDA has approved this, but the FDA might help, the process requiring the FDA might be helpful to understand why there's not more of these studies.
Next question, will there be any control arm that may yield results in those that are vaccinated or not vaccinated?
So we are currently, as we're only studying safety, we're not distinguishing between vaccinated and unvaccinated patients. We need to know if this is safe for patients with COVID, irrespective of vaccine. It turns out we also created our study design prior to vaccines. As Dr. Sachs had mentioned, we are underway with other clinical trials involving FOTV, and actually we'd like to, we'll be speaking about that shortly as well in a dedicated webinar. Those do involve vaccine adjuvant. If Dr. Sachs has something else to say about that as well.
If we proceed, if we are able to demonstrate safety in the phase 1 trial and have the good fortune to be then able to move to an efficacy phase 2 trial of MQFPD, then we'll definitely want to make sure to either stratify or control in some manner for vaccination status. That'll be a critical element.
Dr. Cow, can you ask for the name? Can I ask you for the name of the formula for all 3 syndromes?
Oh yes, is Chaiga Jeji Tang. I will type that in the chat box. Oh yeah, wait, excuse me. Are you talking to, are you referring to the 3, when there's the 3 yang symptoms present? Okay, could you repeat the question, Donna?
This one is from, oh, she said yes.
Okay. I'll type the formula in the chat box. Is Chaiga Jeji Tang. Unique formula for those conditions. For this, when we see when we see symptoms and all the 3 yang stages. I learned this from Dr. Wen. Wen.
Can the patients be taking vitamin D, C, and omegas for the trials?
Yes, yes, those are not. There is so Dr. John Chen actually. This deserves restating. He, as part of the FDA application, he came through every single one of the 21 herbs and gave us put together an herb drug interactions list, as well as an herb drug interaction list of each of the component formulas. So each of the herbs, essentially, there were large categories of drugs that are largely well known to be prone to herb drug drug interactions, and those that you mentioned are not of those. So we have a long list of exclusion criteria, and those that you mentioned are not on there.
Do breakthrough cases qualify to participate?
You mean breakthrough through vaccine?
Edith, can you
If it's
clarify?
breakthrough through vaccine, then yes. Actually, either way, we do not specify if somebody had COVID in the past or had been vaccinated in the past. We collect the information and we may review it later, but right now our target is to demonstrate safety.
Question for Dr. Chen. Is this formula available to us with Ma Huang in it?
Well, the current status of Ma Huang, as I'm sure most of you know, is that Ma Huang cannot be used as food. It also cannot be used as dietary supplement. However, the FDA does leave a little bit of a gray area in which it says Ma Huang can be used in its traditional ways. So what happened is there have been some companies that have attempted to contact the FDA and import and use Ma Huang in its original method, which is in decoction based on a prescription. So under that circumstance, you are able to use Qing Fei Pai Tu Tang with Ma Huang in it, as long as you give it in decoction form. So for those of you who are interested, obviously, you can either use Ma Huang in this formula in decoction form, or you can contact UCLA or UCSD and participate in the clinical trial. So both of these methods will be perfectly acceptable and in terms of getting the formula with Ma Huang in it.
Would this study perhaps cause the FDA to reconsider the use of Ma Huang by licensed acupuncturists?
I sure hope so. That's a huge, yes, we're hoping that's one of the things that comes out of it. It's not going to come easily. We do need all your help. There's going to be a lot of work there. But yes, if we demonstrate safety, again, safety of Ma Huang in a critically ill patient population with cardiovascular risk factors. I mean, these are people who have cardiovascular disease as part of their disease diagnosis. This will hopefully go a long way towards the lifting of the ban of Ma Huang.
Yeah, let me add to that real quick. I think I can say for all the people involved in this study, and that is initially what we wanted to do is to come up with additional ways to help the patient fight COVID, and that's why we all got involved, and that's why many of us basically volunteer our time to contribute to this study. And in fact, one of the goals is that hopefully through the study and that we can demonstrate the safety and also the efficacy of Ma Huang, that TCM as a whole can begin the conversation with the FDA again as far as whether Ma Huang can be used for, as herbal medicine for the TCM community or TCM practitioners. So we're hoping this to be a positive seed to begin that conversation.
What length of time do study participants take Qing Fei Pai Tu San?
We're using 14 days.
Would it not be fairly easy to recruit for a safety study? Many of us could potentially volunteer to take the formula for the prescribed period of time. Is that possible?
It's for active COVID patients with active COVID-19. So within the first few days of symptom onset, certainly within 7 to 9 days of active symptom onset. I hope that does not apply to you, but please do reach out to us if that is the case.
I just want to say from a personal perspective, if I were ever to become a COVID-19 patient, I would definitely give UCLA and UCSD a call because I think this is set up very well. And I think the formula should be very effective. So yeah, so I mean, I will be the first to volunteer and participate in the study.
How many people do you need to enroll in the phase 1 study, and how many do you have enrolled now?
We're not ready to share exactly where we are in the process, but we're aiming for 66 patients total. So 33 to Qing Tang and 33 for the placebo control.
Okay. Any possibility the study can be done via telemedicine out of San Diego or Los Angeles area, providing there's a local phlebotomy of the patient can go to?
As long as it's within the LA or yes. So the study design does involve one of our mobile phlebotomists to come to the homes of the study participants, and it is all done through telemedicine, all of it. So with the exception of the phlebotomist who comes in.
Thank you. Dr. Chen, could you give your summary of how you think this is most useful to practitioners and what you would like to see with COVID treatments in the future?
Well, what we'd like to see is in the West, a lot of people don't believe in the studies that are done outside of the United States, such as China or other countries. So hopefully this begins a process of high quality research and evidence medicine, and something that will help to bring Chinese medicine to the next level here in the US.
How else can we help besides getting the word out and recruiting patients? This question is for any speaker.
I think getting you folks' feedback is very helpful. As we solicited advice and expertise from the Chinese medicine, Eastern medicine community from the get-go, the study's still ongoing, and so we really welcome your feedback, your suggestions. And in addition to, yes, sending us potential participants, that would be helpful as well. But we really value your expertise out there. There's only a handful of us and a few of us. So that would be really helpful from my perspective.
I'd like to add that this is.
Looks like we answered all the questions.
Wait, may I answer this one also? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. If we're going to be able to proceed to a phase 2 study, which would be considerably larger, the resources of the Krupp Endowment may not be able to stretch far enough to support that in its entirety. So we are also looking for matching donors. And if anybody has knowledge of folks who would be open to that, we'd be so appreciative for sharing of that.
Just curious, when we do complete the phase 1 study, would the 3 of you be willing to do another update webinar so the people in the TCM community can know where we are and where we go from there?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes, count me in.
Yeah.
And there was another question about when we expect to complete it. Every time we've come up with this answer, it's not worked out. But I should say that we're expecting to within a few months. We're hoping to at least be able to share something.
Looks like one last question. If you can infuse the herbs instead of taking it as capsules as they do in China to get adequate dosing, can you infuse the herbs?
Can you what?
Infuse the herbs like they do in China.
Infuse?
You mean as a decoction?
Well, what they do in China is they, like the slide that I provided at the beginning, they use all the herb, they cook it in the water to obtain the decoction. So if you want to follow the original protocol, my slides have the list of ingredients, how it's prepared, and how often it's given. So you can follow what they did in China. In the US, I think it's going to be quite hard to get all the herbs and all the ingredients to do the same. But if you are able to, then definitely you can try to shadow that approach.
Oh, she asked, it was intravenously.
What is it?
Intravenously with an IV.
Oh no, I wouldn't do this intravenously. This is not done intravenously in China either. It's by oral. So I'm hoping that we can all get together in a few months with good news.
Thank you very much. It's such an honor to be here. It's exactly the webinar that we that really launched this and launched the interest here. So thank you, Dr. Chen.
Yes.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Dr.
everyone. And as a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and you can find it on our TC and Wisdom Tube at eLotus.org tomorrow, starting tomorrow. Or you can also search on our YouTube. You can find it on our YouTube channel. You can search Lotus Institute and you'll be able to find our channel from there, and also enter both links into the chat room. Thank you guys so much. Have a great evening and we'll see you at the next webinar.